Here is what nobody told you about Xi Jinping's trip to Riyadh. While American analysts were busy counting the handshakes and measuring the length of the banquet tables, China was quietly closing deals worth $29.3 billion in a single afternoon. 23 chief executives flew into Saudi Arabia on the same plane as the Chinese president. Not diplomats, not generals, chief executives, the people who sign checks. And here's the part that should stop you cold. This was not a diplomatic visit dressed up as a business trip. This was a business conquest dressed up as a diplomatic visit. The distinction matters more than almost anything else happening in global geopolitics right now. The United States has spent 80 years building a system where oil flows through a dollar-denominated pipeline. Every barrel of Saudi crude, regardless of where it ultimately ends up, gets priced in American currency. That single arrangement, more than any aircraft carrier group or any military alliance, has been the structural foundation of American global power since 1974. And what Xi Jinping brought to Riyadh was a direct challenge to that arrangement. He just did not announce it that way. To understand what happened in Riyadh, you need to understand what did not happen in Washington first. President Biden visited Saudi Arabia in July of 2022 with a specific objective. He needed Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to increase oil production to reduce American gasoline prices ahead of midterm elections. The visit was politically costly. Biden had previously called Saudi Arabia a pariah state over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Walking that back, shaking MBS's hand, fist-bumping him for the cameras, it cost enormous domestic political capital. Saudi Arabia increased production by exactly 0 barrels. OPEC Plus subsequently cut production by 2 million barrels per day. The rebuff was public, deliberate, and documented. 4 months later, Xi Jinping arrived in Riyadh. The contrast in reception was not subtle. Saudi state television broadcast the arrival ceremony in full. Fighter jets painted the sky with the colors of the Chinese flag. 36 gun salutes were fired. The Saudis lined the streets with Chinese flags, not just at the royal palace, but throughout the city. This was choreography with a message. And the message was not primarily about China. It was about who the Saudis believed holds leverage in the emerging world order. The surface event here is a diplomatic summit. That is layer 1. But the economic mechanisms operating beneath the surface are what actually determine where this leads. And that is where this analysis needs to go. Think about what the 23 CEOs represent for a moment. You do not bring your top business leadership on a state visit unless you intend to close deals. You bring your foreign minister. You bring your military attachés. You bring your national security advisor. Xi brought the chairman of Huawei. He brought the president of CITIC, China's largest state-owned investment conglomerate. He brought executives from SABIC, from Sinopec, from the China Development Bank. These are institutions with combined balance sheets exceeding $4 trillion. The $29.3 billion in agreements signed during that visit covered energy cooperation, cloud computing infrastructure, green hydrogen development, satellite communications, and advanced manufacturing. Each of those sectors represents a specific strategic calculation by the Saudis about where they need technological partnerships that American export controls and political conditions have made increasingly difficult to obtain from Western sources. To understand why this matters structurally, you need to go back to 1974. Henry Kissinger negotiated an agreement with the Saudi royal family that became the invisible skeleton of American global power. The arrangement had 2 components. Saudi Arabia would price all oil sales in U.S. dollars exclusively. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection guarantees and would purchase Saudi oil while selling American weapons systems to Riyadh. What this created was automatic structural demand for American dollars from every nation on earth that needed to import oil, which in 1974 was essentially every industrialized economy. Japan needed dollars to buy Saudi oil. Germany needed dollars. France needed dollars. India needed dollars. Every nation's central bank needed to maintain substantial dollar reserves simply to participate in global energy markets. This arrangement generated what economists at the Peterson Institute for International Finance calculate to be approximately $4.4 trillion in structural demand for U.S. Treasury bonds, because petrodollar recycling required oil exporters to reinvest their dollar earnings into dollar-denominated assets. That structural demand for Treasury bonds is what allows the United States to run persistent trade deficits without the currency collapse that would destroy any smaller economy attempting the same thing. Consider what that means in concrete terms. The United States can consume more than it produces year after year because the entire world needs dollars to function. That privilege, what French economist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called the exorbitant privilege in the 1960s, is not an accident of American productivity or innovation. It is a structural consequence of the petrodollar arrangement. Now, the Saudis and the Chinese, in December of 2022, quietly agreed to explore pricing oil sales in Chinese yuan. They did not announce this with fanfare. They buried it in a single paragraph of a 34-page joint communiqué. But the Financial Times retrieved that paragraph and understood its significance immediately. The Chinese yuan is not currently positioned to replace the dollar. That is not the point. The point is that the Saudis are actively constructing optionality. They are building the infrastructure for a world where dollar-denominated oil pricing is one option among several rather than the only option. And the construction of that alternative infrastructure is itself the strategic event, regardless of whether yuan-priced oil ever becomes dominant. Here is where the analysis gets genuinely uncomfortable for conventional Western frameworks. The standard interpretation of Saudi-Chinese relations emphasizes Saudi dependence. China is the world's largest oil importer. China's economic growth requires stable energy supplies. Therefore, China needs Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia holds the cards. This interpretation is not wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter enormously. What China brought to Riyadh that the United States cannot currently offer falls into three categories. First, technology without conditions. Chinese technology partnerships, whether in telecommunications, infrastructure, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, or advanced manufacturing, do not come with human rights requirements, press freedom conditions, democratic governance expectations, or geopolitical alignment demands. American technology transfer increasingly comes with exactly those conditions, plus export control frameworks that give Washington the ability to cut off access unilaterally. Saudi Arabia learned this lesson concretely when the United States paused weapons sales after the Yemen war generated humanitarian criticism. Riyadh responded by signing $4.6 billion in defense agreements with China that covered drone technology, missile systems, and advanced surveillance infrastructure. The message was unmistakable. Second, market scale that rivals American demand. China imported 1.76 million barrels of Saudi crude per day in 2022. The United States imported 494,000 barrels per day. China is already a larger market for Saudi oil than America is. The leverage flows from where the purchase orders originate. Third, infrastructure investment without political conditions. China's engagement with Gulf states through the Belt and Road Initiative has funded port infrastructure, industrial zones and telecommunications backbone without the governance requirements that World Bank or IMF financing attaches. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 Economic Diversification Program requires exactly the kind of large-scale infrastructure investment that China's state-directed financial institutions are structured to provide. The combined value of Chinese infrastructure commitments to Gulf Cooperation Council states between 2013 and 2023 reached $47.3 billion, according to data compiled by the American Enterprise Institute's China Global Investment Tracker. American infrastructure commitments to the same region over the same period totaled $6.2 billion. Let that comparison sit for a moment. $47.3 billion versus $6.2 billion. That is not a competitive relationship. That is a substitution in progress. Here is what every geopolitical framework misses when it focuses on the spectacle of Xi's arrival ceremony. The question is not whether Saudi Arabia is switching sides. The question is whether the architecture of American global power, the system that makes the dollar indispensable, the system that makes American military protection the only credible guarantee, the system that makes access to U.S. technology the primary ambition of every developing nation, whether that architecture is still operating as designed. The British pound held reserve currency status for 150 years. It did not lose that status because of a single dramatic event. It lost it through accumulation. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was not the cause of sterling's decline. It was the moment when the structural erosion that had been building for decades became impossible to ignore. Britain discovered it could not conduct independent foreign policy without American financial approval. The Americans withheld that approval when Britain and France attempted to retake the Suez Canal. Sterling collapsed under speculative pressure within 48 hours. What Xi's Riyadh visit represents in historical terms is not a Suez moment. It is the decade before Suez. It is the period when British policymakers could still convince themselves that sterling's global role was secure, even as the material foundations of that security were eroding beneath their feet. The specific mechanism being constructed in the Saudi-Chinese relationship is what economists call settlement infrastructure, the ability to conduct transactions without routing them through dollar-denominated clearing systems. The Chinese cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, processed 96.7 trillion yuan in transactions in 2022, an increase of 21.5% from the previous year. It is not yet a rival to SWIFT, but it does not need to be SWIFT's rival to be strategically significant. It needs to be viable enough for a Saudi oil sale to China to clear without touching a dollar-denominated system, and it is already capable of exactly that. Here's what this means for you directly. The petrodollar arrangement is what allows the United States to impose financial sanctions as foreign policy tools. When the U.S. Treasury sanctions an Iranian bank or a Russian energy company or a North Korean arms dealer, the mechanism that makes those sanctions devastating is dollar clearing. If you need dollars to participate in global trade and the U.S. can exclude you from dollar clearing systems, then U.S. sanctions are existential threats to your economy. The moment credible alternative clearing systems exist, that coercive power diminishes. The alternative does not need to replace SWIFT. It just needs to exist as a credible escape route. Saudi Arabia is helping China build that escape route. That is the structural story underneath the ceremony and the banquet tables and the 23 CEOs. The $29.3 billion in agreements signed during Xi's Riyadh visit breaks down in ways that reveal strategic logic rather than commercial opportunity. The single largest agreement, valued at $5.6 billion, covered cloud computing infrastructure development. Huawei and Saudi Aramco's digital subsidiary reached an agreement to build data center capacity across the kingdom. This is not primarily a technology deal. It is a sovereignty deal. Saudi Arabia's digital infrastructure, the nervous system of its economic diversification program, will run on Chinese architecture rather than American architecture. That creates dependencies and relationships that persist for decades beyond any individual transaction. The second largest cluster of agreements, totaling $4.8 billion, covered green hydrogen production. Saudi Arabia's ambition to become the world's leading green hydrogen exporter by 2030 requires electrolyzer technology, storage systems, and export terminal infrastructure. China currently manufactures 72% of the world's electrolyzer capacity. The United States manufactures 4%. This is not a market where American firms can simply decide to compete. The industrial base does not exist at the required scale. Defense and security agreements totaling $3.2 billion covered drone procurement and satellite intelligence sharing. These deals are strategically significant, not primarily for their dollar value, but for the data relationships they create. Satellite intelligence sharing means Chinese and Saudi security services will be working from shared information frameworks. That creates institutional relationships at the operational level that persist independent of any political leadership changes. The remaining agreements covered petrochemical joint ventures, agricultural technology transfer, and tourism infrastructure. Each follows the same pattern: Chinese industrial capacity meeting Saudi capital in sectors where American participation is either unavailable due to export controls, unaffordable due to higher costs, or unwelcome due to political conditionality. Let me be direct about the analytical conclusion that emerges from this evidence. China does not need to defeat the United States militarily, financially, or diplomatically to achieve its strategic objectives in the Gulf. China needs to make itself indispensable to the economic transformation that Saudi Arabia is pursuing through Vision 2030. And it is succeeding at exactly that objective. The metrics are not ambiguous. Chinese trade with Gulf Cooperation Council states reached $234 billion in 2022, an increase of 34.7% from 2021. American trade with the same region totaled $97.3 billion. Chinese foreign direct investment in Saudi Arabia reached $5.5 billion in 2022 alone. The cumulative Chinese investment in the kingdom over the past decade is $23.7 billion, compared to $14.2 billion of American investment over the same period. These numbers represent an investment trend that is accelerating, not plateauing. China is scaling up its economic presence in the Gulf at exactly the moment when political friction between Washington and Riyadh is creating openings for alternative partnerships. The structural dynamic here follows a pattern that historical analysis makes legible. When the British Empire was being replaced as the dominant global power, the transition did not happen through direct military confrontation. It happened through the accumulation of commercial relationships, financial dependencies, and institutional alternatives that made American economic engagement more attractive and more reliable than British engagement. By the time the formal shift occurred, it had already happened in the material world of trade flows, investment patterns, and currency arrangements. China is not building a replacement for American power. China is building redundancy, the ability of global commerce to function without American financial infrastructure as the single choke point. Once that redundancy exists, American sanctions become less devastating. American military deterrence becomes less credible. American political demands become less compelling. The entire architecture of American hegemony depends on there being no viable alternative. China's strategy is to create a viable alternative, not a superior alternative, just a viable one. And Xi Jinping walked into Riyadh with 23 CEOs and $29.3 billion in agreements, because Saudi Arabia, sitting on the world's second largest proven oil reserves and controlling the infrastructure of global energy markets, is precisely the partner that makes that alternative viable. Here is the summary that the ceremony obscured and the banquet tables distracted from. The question of who has the power in the Saudi-Chinese relationship is less important than the question of what kind of power is being exercised and to what structural end. Xi Jinping did not go to Riyadh to replace America in the Gulf. He went to Riyadh to ensure that in the world being constructed right now, America's ability to compel Saudi behavior through financial pressure, export control threats, and security guarantees is substantially diminished. He is succeeding. The $29.3 billion is not the measure of that success. The measure is the settlement infrastructure being constructed, the technology dependencies being created, the institutional relationships being embedded at the operational level of Saudi security and economic systems. The petrodollar system that has underwritten American global power for 50 years is not collapsing. It is being circumvented, slowly, systematically, 23 CEOs at a time. The question that should be keeping American policymakers awake is not whether China is winning the relationship with Saudi Arabia. It is whether the architecture of American global power can be sustained in a world where its most critical structural foundation, the universal requirement for dollar-denominated oil pricing, is being deliberately, methodically, and successfully undermined by the one country that has the industrial capacity, the financial firepower, and the strategic patience to do it. Britain did not lose the pound's reserve currency status in a day. It lost it over a decade of accumulation, of small concessions and alternative arrangements and diminishing leverage until the day came when it discovered it no longer held the cards it believed it held. Xi Jinping went to Riyadh with 23 CEOs because he understands which cards he is collecting.